broadcasting live from our Hawaiian affiliate, our Honolulu affiliate, KWAI 1080 AM. And a tip of the hat and many thanks to Barry Wagenvort. And with us in the studio is Poka Laenui. And am I saying your name right?
Close enough.
Close enough. Well, you want to say it so everybody gets it right?
It's okay. Poka Laenui.
Poka Laenui.
Yeah.
And you are a human rights activist and attorney, one of the leading voices for Hawaiian Independence. You do a radio show here on the station.
Yes.
You're an attorney. You're the convener of the Hawaiian National Transition Authority and an independent advocate for indigenous peoples whose your work has been recognized by the United Nations. That's a pretty impressive resume. It's great to have you with us. Thank you so much.
Well, I wrote the resume, so
that always helps.
It better be, unless I get fired.
Better be accurate, right? So tell us about Hawaii, first of all, just as a state, as part of the United States, where it's at right now, and then I want to get into the history, and then we want to talk about the indigenous peoples and all these other things. There's so much about Hawaii that is so fascinating.
I think that we can begin with the statement you just made as part of the United States. The legitimacy of being part of the United States, and which gives rise to the controversy of are we really part of the United States? First of all, we need to understand geographically. This is Hawaii. That place is North America. Oftentimes we have been told to call it the mainland, but it's certainly not the mainland for many of us. You know, a mainland, when you really think about it, is like the islands of Quemoy and Matsu, or even, Taiwan, relative to mainland China.
That word mainland kind of establishes a hierarchy, essentially.
That's right. So it makes us subservient to another place. But a lot of people don't realize that Hawaii had been an independent nation, had been recognized in the international community. We were a member of one of the first international organization in the world, that's the Universal Postal Union. As an independent nation, we had treaties and executive agreements with almost every other nation that had been recognized in the world. We had 99 consular and diplomatic posts around the world, 5 treaties with the United States of America. We had been regarded as the most literate nation in the world. We had electricity and telephone in our national capital at Iolani Palace before the White House had it in theirs. So we were a really advanced nation, and events occurred in which the United States landed troops in Hawaii and assisted in the overthrow of Queen Leanui. That was back in 1893. The Queen resisted, but then she finally says, okay, I will yield my authority, not to these people who call themselves the provisional government, but to the United States, who through force of arms have committed this international aggression. And she said, I will wait for them to do an investigation and restore the life of the land back to the Hawaiian people.
Day before yesterday, if you could hold the mic just a little closer. Yeah, day before yesterday, Barry was walking us around, and we went to the palace and the statue of the Queen and everything. We saw the place where the Queen had been held hostage, essentially, had been in the second floor of the palace.
Yes, imprisoned there.
She was imprisoned there, yeah. That was by the United States?
No, that was by a people who call themselves now the Provisional Government of Hawaii. And they had acted in collusion with the U.S. Minister Plenipotentiary. Now, many people are not familiar with the term plenipotentiary. Long name, uncertain what it means.
Yeah, I always thought it was like the head guy or, big shot or something.
Yeah,
like
the big shot for the United States here in Hawaii. And his name was Stevens. He had John Stevens. He had been Minister Plenipotentiary for, I believe it was Uruguay. And they kicked him out because he landed American troops and interfered with internal affairs within that government. They sent him off to Scandinavia and then to Hawaii. But he had been previously writing about Hawaii being a ripe fruit ready to be plucked. so that the United States could continue its march across, not only across the northern continent, but into the Pacific and push its way off into the Pacific and into Asia, into the Asian market. And so this was an early plan that he had been writing. It was called a Kennebec Journal.
This was in the late 1800s.
Yes.
Now, I was born in 1951. I remember when Hawaii became a state. So there was at least 50 or 60 years there in between these two events.
That's right. So what happened was that after the yielding by Queen Liliuokalani, Queen Liliuokalani had been a friend to President Cleveland in his first administration.
That was the 1880s.
1880s, that's right. And then when Cleveland ran again, he lost that second election to Benjamin Harrison. And after he ran, he won his second term. So he's the only U.S. president to serve a split term. Liliuokalani had very good relations with President Cleveland, and believing that now that he had been elected, not yet sworn in, she could depend on his integrity to uphold international law and recognize the character of the United States. And so she said, I will yield my authority to the United States until an investigation is done. Something very curious about why she did that rather than fight a war. Because we had the Gatling gun, we had the howitzer cannon, we had troops who were ready to defend the Queen. The United States had the battleship USS Boston in the harbors. But she was also a very interesting character. She was a very strong Christian, and believing that this was the peaceful way was a better approach, she forbade her citizenry to take up arms. Liliuokalani was a student of Hawaii's history. 50 years prior to that, in 1843, the British landed. The British lowered the Hawaiian flag, claimed that Hawaii was part of Great Britain, and for a number of months, we were under the British flag. But then there was an admiral, his name is Thomas, a British admiralty, sailed from South America, came to Hawaii, investigated what has happened, communicated with London, I guess, and then restored the life of the land back to the Hawaiian people in 1843. So it was a very big event. We always celebrated what we call the Restoration Day, and believing that the United States was of the same moral character as the British were at that point in time. And of course, moral character changes in history. So it may have been misplaced faith, but she believed that Cleveland would restore the life of the land. What a lot of people don't understand is that Cleveland, in his second term, actually was suffering from cancer of his jaw. He had his lower jaw removed. He had his Secretary of State had died, and he faced a split Congress, so he had a very difficult time. Cleveland was not able to restore Hawaii's independence.
We have to take a break.
Sure.
For our first hour today, we're talking about Hawaii. We're learning everything we can, about this extraordinary set of islands, this extraordinary land. We'll be right back. Stick around.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Talk right into it. We'll be back in just a moment with Poka Laenui, the Hawaiian Rights Activist, right after this. And welcome back. We're still talking with Poka. So you were telling us the story. We were in the 1880s.
Yes. So what had happened was that this provisional government, and there's a lot of details, and I won't go into all of the details, but sometimes details are important. What happened was that this provisional government, formed mostly of American businessmen, But not only, there were some Germans, there were others who lived in Hawaii. Some of them became Hawaiian citizens. But they wanted to be able, essentially, to sell sugar to the United States. The United States said, well, pay a tariff. And, of course, you don't want to pay a tariff. The same kind of trade war that you know
going on right now.
Yeah. So they were saying, well, how can we overcome the tariffs? And the United States response was, as long as you remain foreign, you need to pay this foreign tariff. So they tried to engage in a treaty in which Hawaii would cede Pearl Harbor to the United States, and in that way engage in that treaty so that the tariff would be knocked
Just
off.
the harbor, sort of like in Cuba with Guantanamo Bay. It was just a piece of the island.
Our king at that time, Kalakaua, says, if I give you sovereignty over Pearl Harbor, then it's an encroachment of sovereignty, of our national sovereignty. I will not do that. So he resisted. These people gathered their rifles. They were called the Hawaiian Rifles, and they approached the king. There were many different efforts to force him to go ahead and agree to this treaty. So they forced him to sign a new constitution in which essentially they elevated their positions above the king. You still had a king there. It's called the Bayonet Constitution, indicative of the manner in which it was adopted. Either you sign it or we'll kill you, we'll kill your family members and the rest. So he signed the Constitution. He got very sick, very depressed, and he traveled to San Francisco, died in San Francisco. And still, many of us feel that actually he was poisoned while in San Francisco. One night he's enjoying himself, he's partying, he's having a good time, and the next day he's dead.
Wow.
So it wasn't because of his illness. That's what many of us feel. Anyway, he came. His body came back. His sister now became queen of Hawaii, and she was intent on changing the powers in Hawaii. These Hawaiian Rifles converted themselves into what they call the Committee for Public Safety, saying that there was an issue of safety among the American whites here in Hawaii. And so they gathered and they met with the U.S. Minister Plenipotentiary, Mr. Stevens, and they negotiated for Stevens to land the American troops under the guise of protecting American lives and property. If you hear the title...
it's like Reagan's invasion of Grenada.
Yes, and if you go even further back to what was happening in Europe, this Committee for Public Safety is not an unusual term. It was already occurring in the French Revolution and the rest. So it's more than just coincidence.
We're hitting a break here. We'll be right back with more of Poka Laenui right after this. Poka Laenui is with us. He is a human rights activist, attorney, one of the leading voices for Hawaiian Independence, radio host, attorney, convener of the Hawaiian National Transition Authority, and recognized by the United Nations for his work with indigenous people. So, Poka, you were during the break. You were kind of recapping how the Bayonet Constitution came about. This was in
1879, I think it was. Okay. I'm sorry if I missed the date right now.
Yeah, in fact, the first Cleveland administration was in the late 1870s, wasn't it? And then the 1880s. I don't recall. In any case, so and then if you
so what happened was there was a Bayonet Constitution in which powers changed. The king dies. In California, his sister takes over as queen of Hawaii, and she intends to change the powers in Hawaii back to the people of Hawaii. At that time, the people who had been called the Rifles now convert themselves into the Committee for Public Safety.
These were the Hawaiians? Or
These were
essentially the Americans.
Essentially the Americans, but not only limited to the Americans. There were Germans and there were others involved. There were 18 of them. And so...
Just 18 men?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, the 18 who were the leaders, and there may have been some, but very few supporters.
Yeah.
You know? Let me bring you very quickly, because I know for radio time moves very quickly.
It does. We're a third of the way through the show.
Yeah. So what happened was that eventually the Americans land. They threatened that they threatened Liliuokalani. Either you surrender or you yield to the provisional government, and we will defend and protect the provisional government, who are basically made up of American citizens. So she yielded her authority, expecting that Cleveland would get into office, and at that time they were inaugurating presidents in March or April rather than in January. So all of this is occurring in January. They take her yielding her authority, they establish themselves as the provisional government. They sign a treaty with the United States and rush it to the United States, so that by the 16th of February, less than, when was that? Less than 20 days, they have a treaty signed and entered into the U.S. Senate for ratification. Why the U.S. Senate? Because the U.S. Constitution requires it, 2/3 of those present in the U.S. Senate. But then the Queen is able to send some of her emissaries sneaking over as businessmen over to the United States, because previously they had forbade any of the Queen's supporters from traveling to the United States. So they finally got to Washington, D.C., and at that time Cleveland was inaugurated, and Cleveland was approached saying, you cannot allow the treaty to go through the Senate because the Queen yielded her authority to the U.S. government, and she expected that an investigation would be done. So Cleveland sends his investigator to Hawaii, Minister Blount, and Minister Blount reports finally back to Cleveland after spending several months in Hawaii. And what Minister Blount says was almost to the man: the people of Hawaii do not support this overthrow. They support Queen Liliuokalani. Cleveland continues to say that through an act of law against a peaceful, trusting, and confiding nation, an independent nation had been overthrown. And he says that as long as I am President of the United States, I will not resubmit the treaty back into the Senate, which means that you have sort of a standstill.
Because the treaty established the primacy of the American folks in Hawaii who were controlling the indigenous people.
It would, but without that treaty, you have the provisional government, whose very name, provisional, which was established to just serve the until annexation could be negotiated with the United States. So what do? You have a president who says, I'm not going to introduce a treaty. He's there for the next 4 years.
So how did it end? We're coming into a break here.
Okay.
How did it end?
Well, it ended by the government, the provisional government, now saying we need legitimacy. So what do? We'll call a constitutional convention, and we'll show you the real American way in which democracy is practiced. Previous to that, Hawaiians were voting in their legislators and all this stuff. We knew what democracy was all about.
Right.
I'll tell you more about, about that
we
story.
still have a half a minute. I misunderstood my cue. I'm sorry.
So this is what they said. They said we shall have a constitutional convention in which there shall be 37 delegates, 19 of whom the president of this provisional government shall appoint. The other 18 would be elected by the Hawaiian people. But before you can vote, before you can run for these offices, you have to pledge your allegiance to the provisional government and disavow any loyalty to Queen Liliuokalani. And this was the basis upon which they held their so-called constitutional convention.
And that lasted until when?
That lasted until 3-4 years later, as they established a new government out of this constitutional convention.
Okay, we're learning the history of Hawaii. It's fascinating with Poka Laenui. Laenui, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And we will be back with Poka right after this break. Stick around. This is fascinating stuff.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here live in Hawaii from our affiliate, our Honolulu affiliate, KWAI AM 1080. And in the studio with us, Hawaiian Rights Activist Poka Laenui, attorney, one of the leading voices for Hawaiian Independence, radio host, attorney, convener of the Hawaiian National Transition Authority, and an international advocate for indigenous peoples, recognized for his work by the United Nations. Poka, if we could just wrap up or bring to present moment the history of Hawaii.
Okay, well, anyway, Cleveland gets out of office, McKinley comes into office, he tries to get the Treaty of Annexation adopted by the Senate, can't do it. So out of the House of Representatives, they submit a joint resolution of Congress arguing that, well, two houses better than one, although it doesn't meet the constitutional requirement. And so they circumvent the Constitution, they adopt a treaty, claim that Hawaii is now theirs, and then they convert Hawaii into the territory.
We did that without two-thirds of the Senate?
Yes.
That's amazing. And so Hawaii became a territory. That would be like sort of like Guam right now. Right?
Sort of, but it's an incorporated territory. And they make a distinction between incorporated, unincorporated, in that if you're incorporated, you can somehow become a state in the future. Yeah, Guam is not in the same status.
So then, between then and the 1950s was...
So they begin the colonization process. They take away our language. They send us to American schools. They control the airwaves. They control trade. They are able to immigrate as many foreigners into Hawaii as they want. And of course, with the United States, it's unlimited. But with China, Japan, and other places, they control who comes into Hawaii. So they manipulate the population in Hawaii, they control the education, they control the media.
So the population became more white and less indigenous?
Not necessarily. To a certain extent, yes, but it's the plane of the mind that they work with.
I see.
When I went to school, pledge allegiance to the American flag, I had no Hawaiian heroes. It was George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and the rest. I know U.S. history far better than I know my Hawaiian history. So it's that colonization of the changing of the mindset. And that's why in the language that I use, and many people in my generation, we always refer to the United States as the mainland and accept the subservience of the Hawaiian position. And then in about the 1960s, things started changing. We started becoming more aware, especially when it was okay to criticize the government, the Vietnam War, the American Indian movement, the Civil Rights movement. So we were able to stand on the shoulders of a lot of those movements and began to start taking a look at what about Hawaii? How is it that an independent nation, regarded as one of the most well-developed nations in the world, now our people are the homeless? So it forces us to take a look at the history. And so now you have a regeneration of the pride in culture and a look at the history and a retelling of the history from a more indigenous perspective rather than from a foreigner's perspective. In the meantime, they are moving Hawaii until 1959, and they are finally saying, okay, now we'll give you an opportunity for a fair choice, a free choice, the right to be a state of the United States. If you go just a step back, in 1945, the end of the Second World War, the United Nations is formed. And they provide a particular part in Article, I think it's Article 11, in which they say that non-self-governing territories must be given the right to choose for themselves what do they want. It's the whole idea of we cannot allow the kinds of stuff that occurred with the Germans coming in and taking over another country. We need to follow this policy of self-determination. They identified Hawaii in 1946. The United States submitted to the United Nations. Hawaii is one of those places that we need to decolonize. And in that process of decolonization, the standard is you allow the people three choices: independence, free association with the colonial government, or integration into the colonial government.
Statehood.
Statehood. So those were the three choices. 1959 comes about. The question on the ballot, shall Hawaii be immediately admitted into the Union as a state? Answer, yes or no. Free choice. You vote yes, we become a state. You vote no, we remain a territory of the United States.
No independence choice.
No independence choice.
Oh my.
Independence was not even discussed. There's a second aspect of this fraud, and that's why I call it a double fraud. And they said that the only people who can vote in this election are U.S. citizens who had been in Hawaii for at least 1 year. It's not the folks who had their independence stolen from them, but it is the Americanized people who are now residents of this territory.
Right, who are racially and culturally different.
Yes, yes. And so the colonization process has been so great in those 50 or 60 years that they played with our minds. We went through 2 world wars. We learned the American ways. Most of us forgot our language. And then they placed that question on the ballot and allowed all the Americans to vote in our election as well, including the U.S. military. Absolute violation of international standards. And so now they say Hawaii is the 50th state of the United States.
And you consider this a fraud. And how widespread is, how large is the Hawaiian independence movement? And well, yeah, you know, I mean, I told you during the break, I lived in both New Hampshire and Vermont. Both have little independence movements. One in New Hampshire is mostly right-wing cranks, but the one in Vermont, you know, they're a little more serious. I doubt, you know, I think they have less than a 1% chance of ever seceding from the Union, but Vermont was a separate nation at the time of American, signing the Constitution. What is the status of all that here?
Well, I think Hawaii has a different status from Vermont. Hawaii had been recognized in the United Nations as having that right of self-determination. With the United States, Vermont, California, and the rest, that independence movement is quite different. I think California actually, if anyone on that movement towards independence, California with its large economy is a more likely one.
They could pull it off.
Yeah,
So.
Texas is another interesting story, but we won't get into into that story.
So
but in Hawaii, the movement is in a growth, and the local newspaper had taken a survey back in about the 1980s, 1990, and they found that among the people of Hawaii, they felt that the sovereignty issue, the sovereignty movement, about 80% supported the sovereignty movement. But when you ask them, what is the sovereignty movement? They're not certain. Is it an independence movement for Hawaii? Or is it the recognition of the illegalities that have occurred, which is undeniable, and that some result should come about as a result of that, or some remedy should come about, which includes what they often talk about, federal recognition. Okay, we'll recognize you Native Hawaiians as Indian tribes. And so within the Native Hawaiian group, you have a large disagreement. Some are saying, we are a nation, we are not an Indian tribe. Others are saying, but that will give us a foot up in terms of better treatment, we'll get federal funding, we'll have our institutions recognized, and so they want that. So you've had this division within the Hawaiian population. Other people are saying, and many Hawaiians are saying, that this cannot be seen as an indigenous movement. The Hawaiian nation consisted of people of many different races. It wasn't an indigenous or limited only to the indigenous people, but it came out of the indigenous people. You had Chinese, you had Japanese, you had Filipinos, you had Caucasians, you had people of many different races. So when you see it from an American perspective as if it's a racial issue, that's the wrong way of perceiving the Hawaiian nation. That's why it's a national movement rather than an indigenous movement or a racial movement.
Is there any chance?
Oh, yeah. But the thing is that we need to start moving our own people to understand the possibilities of eventual independence. And it doesn't mean that we're going to kill off the foreigners, we're going to send everyone away. But what we're saying is that let us learn to integrate, get into the system, and move the system. So eventually we will be able to take over the system. I think the example is Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. I've never been there, but I heard about what had happened. So they moved within that Russian system until they were able to overtake. And so
It's partly the collapse of the Soviet Union that brought that.
yes, and some people are saying that you are also seeing the collapse of the American empire.
Well, that's a good point, particularly under Trump. That's incredible. We have a minute to the break. There's a big difference between, well, I mean, as with any indigenous culture, Hawaiian culture and what we would call Western culture, European culture. I'd like to get into that with you.
Sure.
What do you think are the largest differences?
I think there's what I call a deep culture. And it's not necessarily a racial divide, but it's how people perceive. Even in the United States, you have more than one culture. But the governing culture at the present time is governed by three fundamental principles: domination, individualism, and exclusion. So this is what I call a DIE culture, D-I-E. That's the way economics is being run. That's the way education operates. That's the way you deal with the environment. Domination, individualism, exclusion.
And we'll hear about the Hawaiian end of this in just a moment. We're talking with Poka Laenui. He is a Hawaiian rights activist, attorney, one of the leading voices for Hawaiian Independence, radio host, convener of the Hawaiian National Transition Authority, international advocate of indigenous peoples. We'll be right back. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And the website is hawaiianperspectives.org. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Poka Laenui is still with us, and you were talking about the American culture, or I don't know, how would you define it? I usually refer to it as Western culture.
And yet it's not. If you really study the American history, you read the early poets, within that culture, they were not necessarily saying it should be based on DIE, or domination, individualism, and exclusion. There should be some sense of kindness, some sense of respect for the environment, many of the softer aspects of the culture. But what has happened is that you have seen the very hard DIE culture essentially take over the formal systems.
So the pushback you're talking about, like Whitman and Thoreau,
yes,
that era,
yeah,
and the Transcendentalist movement.
Yeah, and you cannot deny that they played an important role in the development of the character of the United States. So among people, it's not that they are all one way or the other way, but even within an individual, you have this sort of this yin-yang. But the society itself, the domination of the society is controlled usually by a DIE culture. Even in Hawaii, you have the DIE culture.
That's the basis of capitalism, too.
Yes.
I mean, it's just that there it is. So the alternative to that is?
The Hawaiian concept, instead of domination, is what we call olu-olu, sort of a kindness. We can still disagree, but that doesn't mean that we are eternal enemies. You know, we can agree on many other things. We can still create a different relationship, olu-olu. Instead of individualism, the Hawaiian word is lokahi. We need to think of the group. We need to think of the tribe, of the family, of the larger group. In education, rather than teaching students individually, when students cooperate and teach one another, and if they can be graded as a class, if you're even going to engage in a grade, you know, you find that you can be far more productive in group thinking, concern for the larger group. Instead of exclusion, it's always with the concept of aloha. Although we have differences among ourselves, we need to incorporate, bring in this sense of loving kindness. That forms olu-olu, lokahi, and aloha, what I call ola culture. It's a different set of values that you find in the the rural communities. You also find it in Honolulu, but not as predominant. You find it sometimes in families and how families operate. Sometimes you also have this DIE concept that operates.
Unfortunately. But what you're talking about, I wrote a book called Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight, and one of the main premises of the book is that there's these older cultures and these younger cultures, and that basically Western civilization is a younger culture. It's a new eruption of a new weird idea that has been rejected repeatedly by older cultures, indigenous cultures, literally all around the world. This is the big contrast that you're talking about.
It is, and it's many of us have the two cultures within us. I, as an attorney, walk into a courtroom. I'm operating on the Dai culture. I need to represent my particular client, etc. But when I'm out in the community, my culture needs to change. I need to adjust. The problem is that a lot of people don't understand that they are functioning within a deep cultural concept. And so they just meander through one or another system, but not fully appreciating it.
There you go. We'll be right back with Poka Laenui right after this. Here in Hawaii, and you were talking, before the break, we were talking about the Dai culture, basically Western civilization, or whatever, what I call younger culture in Last Hours of Ancient Sunlight. And then you were talking about this older culture, if you want to recap that very quickly.
Sure. First of all, the whole idea of deep culture, a lot of people don't understand or realize that they operate within a deep culture. In Hawaii and in many other parts of the world, you have this domination, individualism, and exclusion culture that controls the formal systems, the economic system, the education system, the environmental system.
This is the water you swim in when you're walking into a courtroom as a lawyer.
That's right. On the other hand, when I'm out in the community, I operate on a totally different culture. Instead of domination, it's olu olu, with a more gentle kindness to it. Instead of individualism, it's lokahi, thinking of the group, the tribe, the larger people involved. And instead of exclusion, it's always aloha, a sense of loving kindness, caring, sharing, things like that. So the deep culture is what really determines how a society functions. And you have dysfunction when you operate only under a Dai system. You kill your environment, you kill your economic system, you start dividing people against other people, that kind of stuff. I believe that a society cannot long last. A healthy society will not last under a Dai system. It needs to investigate and start making changes in the deep culture. And we all have the roots of that softer, caring, loving system. And we better start making the changes as quickly as possible.
It's part of us as people. And yet the whole libertarian movement, the billionaires who are funding it, the guy who's in the White House right now, they all represent the Dai system that you're talking about in spades. I mean, this is literally everything that they're invested, particularly the individualism and the domination part, and the exclusion part. I mean, we are the billionaires. We made our own money. We are self-made men and all this kind of stuff. This crazy stuff. So in Hawaii, what is the concept of hapa?
Well, I think if you take from the deep culture, especially the exclusion part, George Bush was a great priest for that idea. Either you're with us or you're against us. There's no in between. There's no, well, let's think about it.
Right.
Hapa is the same idea. Hapa is the idea that there is gray between or in life. It's not only black and white.
There's a middle ground.
Yeah, there's a lot of middle ground. In terms of racial appreciation, who is Barack Obama? Black man or white man? He's Hapa. He's in between. He's a mixture of many, many other things. Aside from even race, he's a human being, he's a father, he's a thinker, he's many things.
By the way, Hawaiians know that he was born and lived here.
Oh, yeah.
Barry drove us by the apartment building where he grew up, yeah. I can't believe Trump had that scam going, with the birther movement. It's insane.
Yeah, it's crazy. But in Hawaii, what you have is this idea of mix, this cosmopolitan idea. I am Native Hawaiian. I am Caucasian. I am Chinese. My wife is all of that plus even more. My children are so confused. It takes too long to memorize all of their races. Hawaii is a place in which we understand. Maybe we don't use the word hapa as much as we did before. But this idea of mixing things together, we have this custom of what we call mixed plate. Now it's becoming more popular in mainland USA, in which you're not only going to have an Italian dish. What we have in mixed plate, we have hot dog, we have kimchi, we have daikon, we have rice, and we have a mixture of many different things. That's part of hapa, the mixture of all of the different cultures and opportunities that we have had, as well as races, religions. My wife's a Buddhist priest. My daughter's a lay minister for a Pentecostal church. I'm so confused.
Wow, that's quite a contrast. Yeah.
But we're still a family.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's the idea of hapa.
So, in the minute that we have left, how do we bring this to the larger culture of the United States?
I think conversation is the most important for people to be able to engage in, not to be lectured to. And that's why these kinds of programs in which you can even hear the audience calling in, expressing themselves, and you can have a free flow of intelligent conversations. And so I think your role, when I'm on the radio, my role, and other people, media has to be taken back. We need to build transparency. The role that media is supposed to do to build transparency in this society's conversation, that's so important. And that, to me, is the best solution to bring in correction, both within the American experience as well as in the Hawaii experience.
And telling basically people that the path of the billionaires is not the or the culture really of the billionaires is so toxic. Poka Laenui, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure.
It has been an honor and a pleasure to talk with you and to meet you and to have you in our studio, or in Barry's studio. In your studio, this is where you do your show. Thank you. Poka Laenui. We'll be back. Thank you.